There is a moment in many relationships that people almost never recognize while it's happening. A moment when love quietly begins changing what feels acceptable. Not because the behavior changes overnight. Because your tolerance does. The frightening part isn't that someone disrespects you. The frightening part is realizing how easily affection can convince you to live with it. People often imagine disrespect as something obvious. A betrayal. A public humiliation. A cruel argument. But most disrespect doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives in small moments that seem too insignificant to challenge. A message ignored. A promise forgotten. A sarcastic comment disguised as humor. A lack of enthusiasm that didn't exist before. You notice it. You feel it. But you don't call it what it is. Because you love them. Because you remember who they used to be. Because part of you believes this version isn't permanent. And that's where the danger begins. Not in the disrespect itself. In the explanations. The human mind becomes remarkably creative when attachment is involved. You tell yourself they're stressed. You tell yourself they're tired. You tell yourself they're dealing with something. You tell yourself they didn't mean it that way. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. And every explanation feels reasonable on its own. That's why people rarely notice what is happening. The relationship isn't changing all at once. It's changing one excuse at a time. One justification at a time. One compromise at a time. Until eventually something strange happens. The things that once bothered you begin feeling normal. The things you once promised yourself you'd never accept become routine. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. Because emotional adaptation is quiet. Very quiet. You don't suddenly wake up with lower standards. You slowly become accustomed to disappointment. You slowly become accustomed to inconsistency. You slowly become accustomed to feeling less important than you used to feel. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changes completely. The person who once made you feel deeply valued begins making you feel uncertain. Not all the time. Just often enough. And uncertainty has a peculiar effect on people. It creates a tension. You begin analyzing behavior that once felt effortless. You start wondering why conversations feel different. Why replies feel colder. Why affection feels less spontaneous. Why enthusiasm feels forced. You notice yourself replaying interactions after they're over. Looking for clues. Looking for reassurance. Looking for evidence that things are still okay. That's when attachment begins turning inward. Instead of observing their behavior, you start questioning yourself. Maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe you're being sensitive. Maybe you're overthinking. Maybe you're the problem. And that shift changes everything. Because the moment you begin doubting your own reactions, disrespect becomes much easier to tolerate. The emotional focus quietly moves away from what they're doing. And toward whether you're allowed to be hurt by it. That's a dangerous place to live. Because now every disappointment becomes a debate inside your own mind. Every hurt feeling requires justification. Every emotional reaction needs permission. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin abandoning yourself to preserve the relationship. The strange thing about emotional attachment is how easily it changes perception. A stranger ignores your message. You move on. Someone you love ignores your message. You wonder what changed. You reread old conversations. You check whether they viewed your story. You tell yourself not to care. Then check again anyway. You become emotionally invested in tiny signals. A heart reaction. A delayed response. A change in tone. A short answer where a longer one used to exist. Most people don't realize how much power they've surrendered until their mood starts depending on someone else's attention. That's the part people rarely admit. The terrifying part is realizing how relieved you feel over basic affection. A good morning text. A thoughtful question. A little enthusiasm. Things that once felt normal now feel rewarding. And that emotional shift reveals something uncomfortable. When respect becomes inconsistent, appreciation often becomes exaggerated. You become grateful for behavior that should have been standard. And that's usually where emotional imbalance begins. You stop expecting consistency. You start celebrating exceptions. One good day erases several bad ones. One affectionate conversation makes you question your own concerns. One moment of emotional closeness convinces you things are improving, even when nothing has really changed. Love can make people astonishingly patient with behavior that slowly damages them. Not because they're weak. Because attachment creates hope. Hope that the person you first met is still there. Hope that things will return to how they used to feel. Hope that this phase is temporary. Hope can keep people emotionally invested long after reality starts sending different signals. And the longer that hope survives, the easier it becomes to tolerate things that once felt unacceptable. That's why disrespect rarely feels obvious from the inside. It arrives gradually. Like a room becoming darker so slowly that your eyes adjust without noticing. Until one day you compare the present to the past. And suddenly the difference feels impossible to ignore. You remember when they used to ask deeper questions. When they noticed little details. When your presence seemed to matter more. When conversations felt alive. When attention felt natural. Now you're carrying conversations that used to carry themselves. You're creating emotional energy that used to exist on its own. And the loneliness of that realization is difficult to describe. Because you're not alone. Yet somehow you feel unseen. You start talking just to avoid silence instead of feeling understood. You start sharing less because enthusiasm is no longer guaranteed. You start anticipating disappointment before it happens. And eventually you become careful. Very careful. You choose words strategically. You avoid certain topics. You suppress reactions. You minimize needs. You lower expectations. Not because you want to. Because you've learned which parts of yourself create friction. And that's when people slowly stop recognizing themselves. The relationship begins shaping behavior in subtle ways. You become easier to disappoint. Easier to dismiss. Easier to overlook. Not because your value changed. Because your willingness to tolerate changed. The frightening reality is that love can sometimes make self-betrayal feel like loyalty. You convince yourself you're being understanding, patient, supportive, compassionate. Meanwhile, you're accepting treatment that quietly damages your self-respect. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to identify where the line should have been. Because every compromised boundary becomes the starting point for the next compromise. The emotional baseline keeps moving. The disrespect doesn't need to become dramatically worse. Only slightly worse than yesterday. Then slightly worse than that. And because the changes happen gradually, adaptation keeps pace. Until eventually you're tolerating things that would have shocked an earlier version of yourself. That's the moment many people fear most. Not realizing someone disrespected them. Realizing how long they accepted it. Realizing how much of themselves they traded away to maintain emotional access. Realizing how much energy went into protecting a connection that wasn't protecting them. And perhaps the most painful realization of all. The relationship didn't change overnight. Neither did the person. You changed too. You became more willing to overlook. More willing to excuse. more willing to stay. Because love often convinces people that losing the relationship would hurt more than losing parts of themselves. And sometimes that's exactly what makes disrespect tolerable. Not because it feels good. Not because it feels right. Because attachment can make almost anything feel survivable. For a while. Until one day you look back and notice something deeply unsettling. The disrespect wasn't what changed you most. The adaptation did. The excuses did. The compromises did. The quiet moments where you taught yourself to accept what once would have hurt too much to tolerate. And that's the truth people struggle admitting out loud. Sometimes the most damaging thing about disrespect isn't experiencing it. It's how gradually love teaches you to live with it. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.